So I guess while people are filling that out, welcome to our first session of Deep Dive into Design. This session will cover the RW Kern Center. Thank you all for coming out this early in the morning. This event is being hosted by Built Environment Plus. We're a sustainable design nonprofit that drives sustainable design within the built environment. We're joined by Chris Chamberlain, Bruce Douglas, Sarah Draper, and Christopher Nielsen, who've all worked and are currently working. Sorry, just received word from Meredith, who have all worked on the RW Kern Center project. If you could fill out the poll question, that'd really be appreciated. And thank you to those who are writing their other responses in the comments. I'll give polling a few more seconds. So I don't know if everyone can see the poll results.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Great. All right. Thank you. Could we start back at the beginning?
Sure.
Hi, this is Bruce Douglas with Natural Systems Utilities. I'll be your facilitator this morning, and I would first love to thank you for coming. But most importantly, a disclaimer, I have not worked on the RW Kern Center. I just fell in love with it as soon as I saw it and began to understand how it works. And I just thought this would be a great opportunity. We thought, the Living Building Collaborative and Built Environment Plus, there'd be a great opportunity to use it as a homegrown New England case study to begin this series of webinars on a deep dive in design towards net zero water. So the Living Future Collaborative is where this idea came from. It's a small group that is working to promote the ideas of the International Living Futures Institute, and this is one example of that you hear more about of a building following their Living Building Challenge. We could have the next slide, please. So this is the first in a series of webinars, and the next two that are coming up in December and February. The goal for the deep dive into net zero water in the city is because we have an opportunity in New England, specifically around Boston, of doing some really ultra water conservation and really approaching net zero water even in a sewered area. Today we'll be talking about a building that's not connected to the sewer. So for that contrast, we're going to be going to New York City, and which has a history of on-site water reuse and ultra water conservation, and using those examples to help set up the opportunity that is become around due to a recent MWRA regulation change in their service area around Boston. It's also appropriate in other cities in New England. And then finally, the deep dive in the February will be into the water energy nexus. And water and energy are so deeply intertwined. And when you're into a point of maximizing your water reclamation, you're often using that water for cooling water. If you have an evaporative cooling system, but also can be used to get thermal energy out of the water. So we'll be talking about the quality of water needed for cooling and the availability of thermal energy from reclaimed water, and just the general water and energy interrelationship and the demand of energy on water in buildings. So hope everyone, if you haven't signed up for all the sessions, that you do so after today. Next slide. So we thank you for doing the poll. Looks like we're kind of focused in the middle: architect, engineer, and sustainability, and a few others. So actually quickly check the chat. Let me check the chat on that. So the chat says we've got layperson, perfect, and then trade association, high performance building. So it's really good cross section here. So I really appreciate your coming and filling out that chat. The next slide, please. So there we go. So we're real fortunate to have 3 presenters who are focused on the RW Kern Center. Sarah is the director there and has a firsthand experience with the center and how it operates and how it's used. Christopher Nilsson from Brunocott is architects who did the architectural design of the RW Kern Center. Chris Chamberlain is with the Berkshire Design Group, who did the site civil aspects of the project, including the water infrastructure design. And I'll be facilitating. I work with Natural Systems Utilities, and we're a design, build, operate firm of water reclamation systems and water supply and wastewater treatment utilities. And Meredith is hoping to join us. She's the executive director of the Built Environment Plus. And again, big shout out, thanks to Meredith and Casey, as they have enabled this workshop to happen with their great organization and coordinating skills. So thanks so much.
Meredith has joined the call.
Oh, hey.
Hi,
Meredith,
apologies.
would you like to say a few words?
Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you guys. I had it in my head that we were starting at 9 and not at 8, and so in full disclosure, so I'm glad to make it, and looking forward to today's presentation. It should be great. I'm really excited about it.
Good, thank you. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is an outline of what we're going to be going through today. And what I'd like to do, just to kind of keep things moving, because we do have a packed schedule, is just to go right into the introduction to the RW Kern Center. So that'll be, oh, we have a breakout session. Aha, let's go back. Let's go, the breakout session. Let's follow the schedule. When in doubt, follow the directions. So Meredith, you want to talk about the breakout session setup and how that's going to work?
Yeah, so what we're going to do is, the concept here is really to, instead of this being a just watch, we want this to be an opportunity for everyone to talk. So this is going to be an opportunity to mimic, if we were in real life, meet the person to your left and meet the person to your right. And so we're going to break out for, I think we said, I don't know exactly how long, but Casey has that set up. Is it 3 minutes, 5 minutes, Casey?
About 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes, and have a conversation. And this is the first one. We're going to have a few of these as we go on. And the first one's going to be, what inspired you to come here? And so Casey's going to put everyone on the in the breakout rooms. If you can turn on, if you're able to turn on your videos, that would be great. So we can see everyone as we do this. Then we'll come back together to go on. Thanks, Casey.
Also always fun to see where everyone is.
To see the backgrounds. I was on something recently where they, it took a long time to get into the breakout rooms. My guess is, oh, look, we can join them. I'll tell you when we get back. So everyone go join your breakout room. Or did you get something that came up?
I split everyone by attendees into their own separate rooms.
Okay.
I didn't know if
I think
it
we
made
can
sense.
go. I think we can go join the rooms. I think that would be helpful. Would you guys want to go join the rooms or not?
It'd be great if
Yeah.
it doesn't take too much time. And
Yeah.
I would need to be put in a room because I'm on my cell phone, so I don't have a computer.
Okay.
I probably won't get the directions.
Maybe slightly shorter just because we're running a little late.
Yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. Hi, Ian. Right now we're doing a breakout room portion where we're just meeting people. So I'm going to add you to a room. We have about like 2.5 minutes left. So I'm just gonna pop you in room 3.
Looks like everyone's coming back. You pulled everyone back, Casey? It looks like you need to reshare the presentation.
Yeah, I'm waiting for, we have 10 seconds left until all the rooms formally close, and I'm going to reshare the presentation.
Perfect, thank you. Looks like, Bruce, you're on mute.
Unmute.
You're rotated too.
I'll get it up right.
There you go.
So welcome back again. So we do want, without further ado, let's go to the next slide. Hopefully people made some good contacts there in the breakout session. So we're going to start with Sarah Draper talking about introducing us to the RW Kern Center and the Living Building Challenge. So please take it away, Sarah.
Awesome. And if you can go to the next slide, Casey. So I'm here to give you basically just enough context that we can successfully dive into the details of our net zero water system. So I do just want to quickly talk about why are we even doing net zero water on our particular project or generally. Obviously, most of you who are here are probably aware that water scarcity is an ongoing issue globally, even locally. I mean, we've had water bans in our area in Amherst over the summer. So conservation is obviously a huge part of that. The other thing that I like to think about with water systems is, or at least that net zero water does, is matching water quality to use. So it's not just like, let's conserve water generally, that seems important. It's one of the ways we can conserve water is by not using, expensive to make, high quality water that could be used for drinking for watering our lawns or for flushing toilets. So thinking about what kind of water quality do we need for any particular use and just using that. You'll see we also, for us, net zero water adds to resiliency on the project. So we are a little bit more self-contained than perhaps your run-of-the-mill project. And notably for some people, net zero water systems can help reduce costs in terms of how much water you might use or what kind of ways that water needs to be processed, connecting to sewers or not. So just kind of some things to keep in mind as far as big picture as we move forward. Next slide. So again, this is the RW Kern Center. Hopefully it looks like that today. Hopefully it's that sunny. We can head to the next slide. So the RW Kern Center, and it was completed in 2016, so it's been around for a little while now, is a living building. And it is explicitly intended to be a model for positive transformation in the built environment. And my job, what I'm usually doing every day, is to help more people understand what the building is and how it works, and to help them move forward and build their own regenerative systems. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know, we are located at Hampshire College out in Western Mass. Hampshire is a small liberal arts college. We are all about self-led learning, civic action. I personally like to say that we put the liberal in liberal arts. That is not a condoned slogan, but it's very true. Next slide. And so RW Kern Center is our new admissions building. So it has admissions offices, financial aid offices, classrooms, about 4 classrooms, and a cafe where we serve coffee and otherwise mostly pre-prepared foods. So we're not doing a lot of cooking on site. And again, it's this model for sustainable building. We want people to come and learn from the building. Next. And it's also important to note that the building was also explicitly designed, created to help support Hampshire's educational mission to create leaders in sustainability. So some of the things, some of the elements of our water system that you'll be looking at are not necessarily there for performance reasons. They're there because we wanted people to be able to see and interact with the systems. Next. So I'm not going to go through all the project goals. I think it's just important to note that the commitment to Living Building Challenge and Net Zero Water came up front and was really, you know, we were committed. That's what we were going to do. And that was a really important part of making this building and these systems work. That upfront commitment of, okay, well, we're going to get to Net Zero Water, and whatever we need to do to get there and however that works, that's how we'll make it happen. Next. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with Living Building Challenge, or maybe just a refresher, we'll just talk a little bit about what that looks like as a standard. So LBC essentially asks this question of what does good look like? Or the way I think about it, you know, what does it take to make a building that has positive impact on people and the environment? So that's kind of our overall goal in this net zero water system. Let's make something that works for both people and the environment equally. Next. And so LBC answers that question across these 7 categories, which they call petals. And those categories further break down into imperatives, which are a little bit more specific. So this includes stuff like, you know, you can see an energy petal requiring something like net zero energy. So we're a little bit more familiar with stuff like that, like net zero energy, or maybe even materials, thinking about material health, what kind of materials you want to put in the building. But LBC also includes kind of these softer petals like equity and beauty. You know, we want to create a place that people can enjoy being in. We want to create a place that supports people's physical and mental health. So it's kind of it's pretty well-rounded standard. And then the other crucial part is this proven performance, and we're going to be talking a lot about that. You know, it's not enough to say we made a net zero energy building or we made a net zero water building. We have to show with a year's worth of performance data that yes, this building is operating as a successful net zero water or net zero energy building. And that's really important. Next. So what we're going to be looking at today are these water petals. So net zero water and ecological water flow. And I will say that, you know, we certified under LBC version 2.1. So this has changed slightly, but I wanted to give the context for what our actual design process was. So net zero water is basically just, you know, operate within the water resource budget of your site. However much rain or water you're going to naturally be getting on that site, that's your water budget. That's what you need to design to. And then ecological water flow, managing water on site according to whatever the indigenous condition of that site was going to be. So however water flowed across that site before you put a big old building in the middle of it, that's what you want to get back to with human ingenuity and engineering. So that's including stormwater, gray water, and black water. All right. And I'm actually going to skip these next few because I want to hear from Christopher and kind of get going on what that meant for our actual project, what the design process was for the Kern Center. So if you just skip maybe 2 ahead. Although you can enjoy these beautiful pictures of the RW interior.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. So I think that was a good sort of overview of living building, the building specifically, and then a really nice overview into water and what the goals were that we were trying to achieve. So I had the opportunity to be part of the architecture team that took the project. My role was taking the project basically from design development through construction and through the performance year, where we actually proved that the building could operate the way we had designed it to do. But today we want to focus a little bit more on how we approached water, specifically knowing the imperatives that the Living Building Challenge handed to us. So we as a design team started by thinking about, you know, the water cycle specifically. As Sarah mentioned, we're thinking about how water flowed through that site in a sort of developed state. And so in a lot of ways, we're thinking about a full water cycle. So we broke that down into what are the uses in a building. The first is fire suppression, which is it's sort of a standalone. We'll get into why and how that worked in a moment. And then the next type of water that goes to the building is potable water. Buildings need potable water to run, especially if they have human occupants in them. Gray water, a term that you guys all are probably familiar with, is essentially the wastewater from things like sinks, and oftentimes in high performance buildings gets reused for a second time so that water is able to kind of do double duty. Stormwater, as Sarah mentioned, this is all of the rain that falls on the site. And again, since we're thinking about this from a pre-developed state, in our case, we're thinking about how does that water end up back in the ground on the site based on what we presume was the condition of that site before humans were there. And then lastly is black water, which is the wastewater from toilets and sometimes showers if you have them. In our case, we didn't have to design for them. So these are all the kind of water that we're going to deal with. So next slide. And these were some of the options that we had for what we could choose in terms of developing these systems in the building. So for fire suppression, if we really wanted to try to not connect outside the site, we thought creatively about maybe having a water tank. We'll get into that in a moment. For our domestic water, we kind of, because we know that we're trying to deal with this all on site, we're falling into two options, either digging a well or purifying rainwater. For gray water, again, as I mentioned, this is the first amount of wastewater from sinks. We considered whether or not we wanted to reuse it for a second time. For stormwater, really thinking about how we're holding this, so using things like retention ponds and swales. And for black water, you know, their typical approach would be to connect to a sewer. Again, through the Living Building Challenge, we're trying not to connect outside the site. So we're ending up towards either a living machine or thinking about composting toilets. So next slide. And so once we had this sort of list of options, we started thinking about budgeting and modeling what the uses were in the building. So this is actually very similar to the kinds of budgeting and modeling we do for energy. And what became really clear, and what's probably become sort of a repeat, if any of you have been to other presentations on other Living Building Challenge projects, is that once you kind of get through the number of uses, the amount of occupants, how that flows through the year, and you get to an overall use, there's one key decision that seems to really impact the amount of water used, and that's the toilet that you choose. So it turns out that just by switching to something like a composting toilet, we were able to cut the amount of potable water that we needed to use in the building in half. And so that also then cuts in half the amount of wastewater you have to deal with. And in our case, eliminates altogether the black water that we would be producing with a conventional toilet. So next slide. So the next thing I just want to go through is sort of our approach and some of the systems that we did choose, and then the regulation under which we had to develop them. So the first one, as I mentioned, we were trying to think creatively, how could we completely not connect to the outside of the site? We got a lot of pushback for a fire suppression system to make a real connection to a municipal source. And it was one that we felt like, based on human health and safety, that we should probably stick with. So we're going to kind of consider that one a little bit outside, which is why I've drawn that red line. And it turns out that by having this municipal connection, it ended up with some other benefits, which we'll get into in a moment, probably when Chris starts to his part of the presentation. So we'll go down for the rest of them. For domestic water, we couldn't really say with a lot of confidence that the site that we had would be able to absorb enough water into a well that we could provide the water with the well. So we really sort of backed into collecting rainwater and purifying it. And we'll get into some of the details on that in a moment. For gray water, again, we chose actually not to really recapture any of this gray water, but it basically becomes the wastewater for our system because we've eliminated any of our black water. Stormwater, this one's actually a little more straightforward. Like I mentioned, we're just developing systems in the landscape. They are pretty highly engineered, but the idea is that we're just reabsorbing all of that water. And as I mentioned, we chose composting toilets, again, to sort of fulfill some of the other needs. So you go to the next slide. What we've done here is just sort of outline some of the regulatory path that we had to take and who the agencies were that were really controlling how we could achieve this. And so for a lot of this, you know, what the big kicker was that because our building was going to serve more than 25 people, this building is considered a public drinking source. And so because of that, it is governed by federal standards that are implemented by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. And so this is a pretty high level of standard beyond which you would be held if you were digging a well for a standalone house somewhere in the country. And what you'll see here is that that organization shows up in two places. So because we're trying not to connect to municipal water and municipal sewer, that's not sort of a standard path. We were close enough that by code, that was what we should be doing for our wastewater and for our drinking water. So for our wastewater and gray water system, we actually had to apply for a pilot program to not connect to the sewer. And we'll get into some of the details on how we achieved that. I'd say the other thing that's just to keep in mind is that the local Board of Health was also involved in a lot of these systems, more specifically with our composting system. And Sarah could probably tell you a little more about some of the operations that go on in order to keep that a hygienic process. So next slide. So what you start to see is that we're basically meeting code for fire suppression because of the pushback that we received. Our stormwater approach is actually exceeding what we would be required to do normally. So that really just becomes a design challenge, not really a regulatory challenge. And if you go to the next slide, what we really started to hone in on is that we have two big systems that we're pushing forth that are not, business as usual. One is our rainwater harvest system, and the other one is how our wastewater is being dealt with a gray water system. And so from a design and approvals process, we started very early. This also outlines essentially the design and the beginning of construction for the project. And so you can see we're starting really early on with all the stakeholders, with Mass DEP, having conversations about what it is that we want to do. And going through a round of submission, getting feedback, incorporating those comments into our design and applying again. And as I mentioned, we're designing a building through all of this. So we're taking a bit of a leap of faith that we're going to get this approval at the end of the day. And so I want to underscore that, Sarah's organization was willing to take that risk with us and was willing to kind of go out on a limb and try to do this. I don't know how much Carl knew he was going out on a limb, Sarah, when we were going through this. But we didn't know if we didn't have a whole lot of confidence that we were actually going to get approval. And so, in March of 2015, we were thrilled when we had finally gotten a letter back saying that we were able to move forward with the design that we had. So next slide. So this again is that same number of systems, mostly color coded with the bubbles on the left-hand side to sort of show you how those systems work. And again, this really is a cycle starting with rain that falls on the site and falls on the roof, being captured by two cisterns, aka reservoirs, that get filtered to provide all the potable water in the site, and then make their way through the building through their uses, and then again back out into the site where eventually they are reabsorbed into the site itself. So we're going to dive in and look at some of those specifically now. Next slide. So starting with the site itself, what was really interesting is that these systems, we worked with both our civil engineer, Chris Chamberlain, and our landscape architects to develop the entire site to express how some of these are actually working. And so you can start to see how some of the rainwater is flowing around the building. And in fact, our treatment also starts to show up in the form of a constructed wetland. Next slide. And the design concept for this was to make this an expressive landscape and building form itself. And so the landscape, you can start to see these elements that are treating the storm water, showing up in planted rain gardens and things like that. And in the building, we wanted to make a design move by expressing a very large thin roof that overhangs the building, because this is what's doing our capture. This is what's actually capturing the water that's going to power the building. Next slide. And to give you a little bit of an overview just of the building itself, it's a basic bar building that's been bent a little bit and pulled apart on the first floor. And so it's predominantly an admissions building. So there's a lot of offices on the right-hand side, but we also have some classrooms and a large common space in the middle. And the common space in the middle we thought of as an opportunity to start to, as Sarah mentioned, to really show off how some of these systems are working. Next slide. Second floor is somewhat similar, more admissions on the right-hand side. We do have a financial aid suite on the left and a couple of classrooms thrown throughout. But next slide. Perhaps the most exciting for the water system is the basement. And there's a couple things I think to note here. One of which is that we don't actually have really very much enclosed space down in the basement. We left the walls at about knee high to really show off all of the systems, as this is part of the tour that Sarah and her colleagues give. So you can really see how everything functions. The other thing I think that's worth noting is just to see the scale of the composting room in comparison to a lot of the other water things that are going on. It really is a spatial planning issue when you're thinking about doing these composters. We'll get into that a little more in a moment. Next slide. All right, so we'll start at the beginning of the cycle with the rainwater harvest. So we're capturing rainwater from the roof that falls down through a series of gutters. And next slide. We start to see that on the right-hand side. We have two long linear gutters at the very edge of the low end of the roof that feed two different sides of the building. This gives us sort of a duplicity of places that we can pull from water, but it also just worked with the geometry of the building and cut down on the size of the tanks. That water then is funneled down the downspout, and then if you go to the next slide, goes through a series of preliminary filtration. So the top small canister in gray is the vortex filter. This is where big debris like sticks and all that kind of stuff are able to fall out. It then funnels down into the next largest gray tank. If you go to the next slide, this tank is if we have small, medium, large of 3 tanks in this diagram, the medium one in the middle is the first flush tank. And the idea behind this is that it fills up with the first amount of rain that falls on the roof, which has usually got a lot of dust and things like that in it. So once that tank fills up, then water is able to pass directly down and into the large concrete cistern. You can start to see that we have, Chris helped develop this design. There's some smart things like there's an upturn down at the bottom, so you're not stirring up all the muck at the bottom. The little hose that feeds the pumps in the basement is floating so that you're also not taking from the bottom. And there's an overflow, and that overflow means that once we have enough water to fill this tank, it's flowing into the rain gardens. Next slide. So once that water makes its way into the building, it's purified in the basement. We're going to get down and dirty with a real tour soon to see how some of that stuff really works. We're using UV filtration rather than chlorine, as the LBC has requested that we not use chlorine, and Chris will get into some of the challenges with that, I'm sure, shortly. And then it feeds a bunch of sinks. We have some sinks in restrooms, we have some sinks in a cafe, and we have 2 mop sinks. That's all a water fountain. And that's all the potable fixtures in the entire building. All of those, as we mentioned, their wastewater is considered gray water. So that's the wastewater that we have to treat in the building. And that's done in 2 ways. One, in a series of filters in the basement, and then also through a planter system in the inside of the building. So next slide. So here's the first set of filtration that happens. All of the water funnels back into 1 tank in the basement where it goes through primary filtration. And in all intents and purposes, a system like this could do a lot of or all of the treatment that's required. But in our design, we wanted to actually express how we might use innovative systems in order to do more filtration and eliminate even more of that wastewater. So from here, if you go to the next slide, that water is pumped into perimeter planters in the commons space on the first floor, all along the glassiest bits of that part of the building. And we designed this in conjunction with Chris as an element that everyone could kind of interact with. So you see on the left-hand side, the section through that curtain wall at the perimeter where we've created a really tall planter bed where the gray water is being fed at the top through a trickle and allowed to kind of filter through that soil media. Some of that water will be absorbed by the plants and into the air through evapotranspiration. Others of it will be treated by the bacteria in the soil, and it all sort of makes its way down to the bottom of that planter and then back down into the basement in that, to the second tank that we saw. Next slide. And so as Sarah mentioned, here's the sort of image of that planter and how people could actually be in that space to be next to and start to interact with some of the living systems in the building. Next slide. And this followed from part of our design intent for this space as well. We wanted there to be a real indoor-outdoor experience. And so by having plants even just on the inside of that glass, you really start to blur that line from where the landscape ends and where the building begins. Next slide. All right, so then waste, human waste in the building is all dealt with composting toilets. And as I mentioned, this is basically a closed system. It's not connected to anything else. And it exists in the format of the toilets and then a collection system in the basement. Next slide. Composting toilets can kind of take two forms. There are what we call straight drop, which is literally a 12-inch plastic pipe that goes from the toilet straight down into a chamber. But there are also foam flush toilets. So in the diagram that's highlighted here on the upper floors, there's a much smaller tube that's able to take some bends and run through the wall and uses some foam and soap in order to flush the debris down. We chose straight drop because we didn't want the school to be tied to a proprietary soap product. I will say, now having done this, one of the lessons I've learned is that by having 12-inch pipes that are connecting, in our case, 3 toilet rooms, means you have an acoustic connection amongst all of your bathrooms, and you might want to consider the implications of that in your design. There are, of course, fans that are always creating a negative pressure so that air is always moving in the correct direction out of the bathroom, but it is something that is quite different than the experience you have in a conventional bathroom. So I'm toying whether I actually like the decision that we made or not. Next slide. And this is an image of that. You'll see this a little bit more. And again, just to sort of reiterate the scale of what we're talking about, this is one of the 2 chambers that are in the basement. You can see the straight drops in the green tubes that are coming out of it from the top, and the liquid waste is being separated and pumped into the white tank beyond. Next slide. And so then finally, you know, the water that falls on the outside of the building also has to be dealt with. And the water is coming from the rain, it's falling off the roof, and we have excess. We also have a small amount of condensate that dribbles out from some of our HVAC equipment. Next slide. And while this isn't a total glam shot, I'm hoping maybe we can find a better one from today's site visit. This is what the wetland looked like day 1. These are actually expressive things, and it does look like more than just a ditch, which is what this photo shows right now. But there are a great variety of plants that then end up thriving in these conditions and sort of change as the amount of water changes throughout the year. Next slide. So then to back up and look at the site again, you can now start to understand those systems. And if you go to the next slide, you'll start to see some of the ways that all of the water systems work. So the blue is highlighting how the stormwater moves around the site to the north, sloping downward into those rain gardens. And the pink line is showing this eventual end location for the gray water in the site. So after it's gone through a second round of filtration in the basement, any remaining water can be pumped out into a constructed wetland. And then as a belt and suspenders, if that constructed wetland doesn't deal with all the rest of the water, it can be pumped into a very conventional septic system, leach field, sorry, to be reabsorbed into the ground. And we sort of proved out that we might not need that, but this was one of the places where, again, regulation required us to provide this backup in the case that the water was not gone by the time it had gone through 2 rounds of filtration in the basement, through all of the planters inside, and then through the constructed wetland in the outside of the building. You can kind of see how happy we were to build that. And Chris might get into that a little bit more in detail. Yep, you can go ahead, Casey, it's fine. I can wrap it up. So once we had designed this, we wanted to make sure that this was something that people could understand and interact with. So we started to pitch ways in which we might have a dashboard for interaction to see how is the system working, how much water are we using. And that's been an ongoing, I think, process. Sarah could probably talk more to that. Next slide. But what we did do is we developed a thorough guide to sort of explain all of the systems of the building, because this was an academic campus, but also was a place where people were going to work. We wanted to make sure occupants knew how the building was designed to function, as there is some amount of this that's not business as usual. But also just as a guide of like, here's all the crazy stuff going on in the building, or, you know, and try to be a jumping off point for students and faculty to study the building. So next slide. And what's been really amazing is to watch this actually take place. Professors have started to study things like, the bacteria that's living in the gray water planter. And it's been really interesting to watch this take place. Next slide. And I think that'll wrap it up for me. I'm excited to kind of move on to the real building again and see it. I haven't been there in a little while. But hopefully that gives a little bit of a prep for how all of these systems are working so you understand what you're looking at while you're walking through the building. Thanks, guys.
Just as the train goes by, I think that was at your house, right?
Yep.
So I think it's time for, if I have the schedule right, which I've got up, it looks like it's time for our next poll. Casey, can you launch that? So Casey's gonna launch the poll and we'll have a minute or so to do the poll. So we wanna know, what water system are you most interested in? And this may help us, the end of the time, we're going to use to have a discussion and ask some questions with the panelists. And this might guide the discussion. So interesting to see what's happening. Not one person's oh, there you go, composting toilets, someone's interested. There you go. Stormwater, no. Drinking water. That's you, Jim? Good. You can always count. I can always count on Jim. There you go. We've got 12 of, well, I'll vote. Oh, I guess I can't vote. A few more people? Maybe you can't vote because all the presenters, you guys should vote too. Yeah, there you go, Sarah. What are you most interested in? What do you like the best? Okie doke. And while we're doing this, Jim kind of kicked us off a little bit, but we absolutely use the chat to ask some questions of the panelists or make some comments, or we really want to encourage communication and not just passive listening. So if you think something's great, if you agree with something the presenter says, please put that in the comments. And if those comments, the chat is bothering you, then feel free to turn it off. And if some people don't like the chat box, I personally do like it. So where are we? So we've got pretty much a tie between rainwater, drinking water, gray water, and all water. So there you go. Bruce, did you want to chime in? Or is that Chris? Okay, I think we're on to Chris and our tour.
Excellent, and I'm glad to see those poll results that people want to know about everything, except for the stormwater, because that's kind of boring on this site. We didn't have to do anything really weird to make the stormwater work. So what we're going to do here is actually something cool. Is we've got someone at the Kern Center with a video feed. So we're going to start walking around and looking at some of these components and look at things in a little bit more detail. Christopher did a great job playing both architect and engineer, explaining a lot of the details of these systems. And so what we definitely want to do is, if we come to spots as we're looking around at these different components in real life where you want to know more, or you literally want to know what is that little thing that I can see there and how does it work, definitely chime in the chat. And if Casey and Meredith can keep an eye on that, because I'll have a tendency to look away from it. But let's bring up, can we spotlight Claire's video now? And so what we're seeing here is, if we'll think back to, as Christopher walked us through, this is really where our journey of the water starts. So we've got about a 9,000 square foot roof surface that overhangs significantly beyond the footprint of the building. And what you're looking at right now is the southern face of the building. And so as you can see, that roof pitches entirely toward us. And on the edge of that roof is a sizable gutter. It's about 18 inches wide and 9 or 10 inches deep. It actually flows from the center of the building in both directions, because Christopher told me there's no way we can architecturally make a gutter in a single slope across the building work. One of the interesting things about this project, which was unusual and great, is that there was a lot of joint design between the engineering and the architecture. As you'll see when we get inside, everything's exposed. And as you can see right here, really critical components of our drinking water system are architecturally integrated. Christopher and Jason Jewhurst from Brunner Cott and I literally spent half a day in their office sketching out different ways to make this gutter work. So that's one of the big lessons learned, which is one of the things we're going to talk about here, is when you're talking about these net zero water integrated systems, you cannot start too early because there are so many interactions and iterations that have to happen. Yeah, so there is a friend. Oh, we lost Claire, but some folks have noticed there's a friend sitting up there at the top, which actually brings us to an important point here. So as we talked about, the water comes off the roof in that downspout. The first place it goes is that small black cylinder that you can see at the top, which we call a WISY filter. WISY, W-I-S-Y, is a brand name, but this is a vortex screen. And so if Claire can move just a little bit to the left, you can see that the downspout comes in eccentrically, and through sort of inertia, when it's raining nice and hard, the water tries to spin around the outside of that cylinder. And in there, we've got a stainless steel basket that screens out the debris and leaves and any other big chunks of anything that owl poop remover, something like that. Actually, on the site, the contractors referred to this as the squirrel spinner. And so what this does is it allows the debris to drop straight down through the bottom and get removed. And then the cleanest water you can see will then exit this vortex and exit to the right. You can see some of this stainless steel piping. The plumbing contractor on this project was amazing, as you can see. They had a lot of artistry in putting this thing together in a way that works. The first opportunity for the water to go is into that large tank that you see in the middle, which is what we call the first flush tank. And so the first water that's coming off the roof is especially dirty. It's got pollen, it's got owl poop, it's got lots of other fine particulates and small contaminants in it. And so because we have ample water available at this site in terms of rainfall compared to what we're using, we'll touch on that in a minute, we throw away the first about 1/10 of an inch of water through this tank, which fills up and then drains down over 24 hours. And only once this tank is full does the water then overflow toward that large pipe on the left and go down into the cistern. And we've got 2 cisterns, each of them 5,500 gallons. So that thing goes about 10 feet tall to store our water. And so now I'm looking at some of the questions right here. The steel basket has to be cleaned out. I believe we found that twice a year seems to keep it in good shape. Literally, you pull the basket out and run it through the dishwasher and it's good to go. What happens is there's a little bit of biofilm, a little bit of pollen that kind of builds up on there. But for the most part, it's self-flushing because the water rushes in and the contaminants and debris and everything want to run straight down. So to a lot of extent, it keeps itself pretty clean. And what you see here is you can actually hook up a hose spigot to one of these buckets and use that first flush water for irrigation. But the little pipe coming out of the bottom has a valve on it that we can set to just sort of drip away slowly over time so that we can keep that. And so that's the answer to the first flush. This is where the first flush gets dumped out. Again, it drips down. It's timed to drip out over about 24 hours. The idea being that it rains real hard, that tank fills up, and we start capturing water from it, and then we reset between rainstorms to catch the next one. And so here you can see, actually, you can see that it is currently dripping and from a little bit of water that's left over, or maybe it's just condensation from the fog this morning. And then that downturned pipe is actually the overflow. You'll notice that the overflow is spaced about 24 inches off the ground, so we can have an air gap there. And it's also got a stainless steel screen in the bottom of it, so we can't have anything trying to crawl back up into our cistern. While this is raw water, it is our drinking water source. So as you can see, we've taken a lot of care to try to keep this water as clean as possible. And right here, I want to pause. One of the biggest hurdles from a regulatory perspective was figuring out what in the heck permit are we actually asking for in order to do this. And so this actually goes back a long ways. There's over the course of about 4 different projects to advance this idea that we actually could capture drinking water and use it as a public water supply. It started with a building that Smith College put together, where we started, our company worked on that a little bit before I got here, and really started looking at, would it be possible to do a rainwater harvest system in Massachusetts? Started talking to the Department of Environmental Protection about it, not with an application in place, but just an open conversation with some of the review engineers there about, if we came to you with this idea, what would happen? And what came out of that was about a 90-minute conversation of our engineers and DEP's engineers talking about, well, what are we really doing here? And Claire, if you step back and kind of take back that first shot of the rainwater harvest system, what came out of that conversation was the key to being allowed to do this whole thing. And the key was that what you're looking at here is not really, from a permit perspective, a rooftop and a cistern, and as we'll see later, a water treatment room in the basement. What you're looking at is a watershed that captures our drinking water, a reservoir that stores it before we treat it, and then a water treatment plant inside the building. And that was the key, was that now we had a structure, we had a way to fit this project within the regulatory structure. Now that Smith College project ended up, because of particulars of the site, it made a whole lot more sense to go with groundwater, but we at least had the thread that would pop up a little bit later. And so then working through some projects at Williams College, at Hampshire College, and also at another project on Hampshire's campus built by an independent group, the Hitchcock Center, we brought projects to DEP, and now we said, actually, now we're in a situation where we are going to apply for this drinking water system. What are you going to say when we do? And what happened then was the first of those projects that went through at Williams College, there was a big, actually a conference call with a bunch of folks from DEP, and someone from Boston got on the phone and started on a monologue about how, in the last 40 years, we haven't had a new surface water source, which this project would be. We've never, ever done a rainwater harvest system for drinking water. Pause. But we think you need Form WS 37. And it was that simple. It was that we had a group of people who philosophically understood what we were trying to do and why, and we're on board with that. That was important. That was luck to some extent. That was the fact that we're in Massachusetts, that we've got a bunch of hippies in the woods that want to make the world a better place. But we also had a story to tell where we could fit this unusual, innovative system into the regulatory structure as it was. We were no longer asking for a special exception. We were asking to apply the rules as they are to this new place. And so we'll talk about the testing requirements when we get downstairs in a little bit. But for now, let's just follow this water toward the south side of the building, and we'll see where we'll see a more glamorous shot of the rain gardens, and we'll look at some of the outdoor gray water aspects of the project. And I spent a lot of time telling those stories about the rainwater here, because that's really an important piece of this, of how we got the ability to do this. And then we'll talk about a lot of the challenges that we faced once we did get that permission. And so what you're seeing here, it's a little hard to tell on the mobile video, but we've got that large swale that wraps around the building. Another key piece that plays into the stormwater that you wouldn't necessarily think is what you're seeing in front of you, which is that we've created a giant successional meadow, essentially, around the building. This gets mowed, is it once a year or every 2 years at this point, Sarah?
It's probably about twice a year, spring and fall, although I did it in spring, given COVID.
Sure. And so, you know, replacing what would traditionally be mowed lawn on the campus with a meadow does a couple of things. Obviously, from a habitat wildlife perspective, way better. It's no longer an ecological dead zone. From a stormwater perspective, it means that we are producing less runoff from those grass areas. Obviously, we're catching some to drink it. And then we're letting the water run through that swale. And this is that rain garden that the exact same rain garden that Christopher showed you on day one, now looks like this. You can see that, and note that there's a bit of a monoculture in the meadow as we planted with grasses and such. But in this rain garden, you see a completely different set of plants that's really taken up root here. Really interesting is those rain gardens in construction, I was really worried about them because they did not work well at all. They held water for a very long time. But once we got the root penetration into those soils and we got some of these shrubs growing that are taking up that water, these things work really, really well. They take on a ton of water. They put it away. We were blessed with a site with marginal soils and high groundwater, but through taking advantage of the area that we had and really planning this thing robustly, we're able to infiltrate, except in the very, very largest of storms, we're really infiltrating 100% of the water that's falling on the site. And this is a second, basically equally sized rain garden that we have here. And Claire, if you swing around to the left on the sidewalk, we've actually got these two large rain gardens connected under the sidewalk with a little stainless steel bridge here so that we can take advantage of all of that volume at once. And so then if we can turn toward the constructed wetland, as Christopher mentioned, in search of water quality for the gray water system, you know, our journey starts in the basement, which is where we're going to get to. We go through those planters that he described in the lobby. And then after the planters, we come out to this constructed wetland. And, you know, one question might be, well, why do you have two sets of treatment on this site? And actually the answer is coffee. You may have noticed that Sarah mentioned there's a cafe in this building, which we're going to tell a couple of stories about as we talk about some of the operational challenges in a minute or two. But it turns out that from a wastewater perspective, coffee is disgusting. And that's okay. I have a cup full of it right here because it's great in our bodies. But once we release it, it becomes really potent wastewater. And not just that, but it has a lot of nitrogen in it. And nitrogen is a tricky thing to get out of the wastewater. And so what we have is those internal planters that we'll look at in a second work for an aerobic treatment. Aerobic meaning high oxygen. So we've got air in there. Those try to keep the oxygen in the soil, and we promote the growth of microbes that thrive on oxygen. Very efficient at chewing up a lot of the pollutants that we're trying to get out of the water, but they are only the first step in trying to remove nitrogen. They don't remove the nitrogen, they just convert it into a different form. Then we come out to this constructed wetland, which remains flooded about 6 inches below the surface. You can't see it because it's below ground, but this concrete box is about 30 inches deep. It's just filled with gravel and with a topsoil and mulch layer. But flooding that and keeping that about 24 inches of water under the surface means that we get a low oxygen environment, and we can then take the nitrogen that's been converted and through a chemical process actually expel it as nitrogen gas and reduce that nitrogen that's coming in primarily from the coffee. Traditional wastewater has a lot of nitrogen, but mostly it's coming from the black water. In this case, we've got this special bit. And so again, literally, this is just a box full of gravel that we send the water through, keep it flooded. It flows in at one end, flows out the other. You know, in the summertime when the building is lightly used and it's hot and dry and sunny, there's probably zero water coming out of here for a couple of months. In the middle of winter, when we're not getting that evapotranspiration, when the plants are dormant and when the college is in full swing, yeah, we're absolutely overflowing from this and discharging it to that traditional septic field. So there's a real balance through the seasons, and we can talk about this a little bit later, but the results, you know, Claire's actually participated in a published paper kind of studying the efficiency of these systems. They really do treat the water incredibly well, and then we're able to discharge very clean water back into the environment. And so that is going to be it for the outside. As we head to the inside, feel free to throw in some questions there. Keeping the system robust while the building is lightly used. Sarah, I think, can talk a little bit better to that than I have, because I haven't been allowed to be on campus very much over the last 6 months. But in terms of how those planters did during the shutdown, they really struggled, I believe, is the answer.
It was tricky. I mean, basically, because they're relying on gray water to be watered, the interior planters at least, I would go in every week or so and just run some water, and I sent out a PSA to campus to say, hey, if you're in the building, wash your hands for a really long time. And try to
That's unusual for a green building to be asking people to use as much water as possible.
Well, it's a public health measure during COVID. Wash your hands thoroughly. Most of them have survived, and the big thing was when the building was occupied again and we had more water use, it took a while for the soil to resaturate. So we got some kind of ponding on top of some of the interior planters when we first started more intensive use in the building. So it was just interesting to kind of watch that soil like reacclimate to different level of water input.
Yeah. And so now we're in the basement, which is, the nerve center of all the water systems. And actually, Claire, if the first thing you could do is take a step to your right and look down the hallway, there's a really important architectural piece. What you'll notice about this room, first of all, just to Claire's left, there's an elevator, which is how we access this area. This is absolutely nerd center. Yeah, absolutely. This is where I get to spend most of my time when I go in the building. This is on the tour. We want people to understand where their water comes from. That's an unusual thing, particularly in this country, is it seems that our water in our sinks shows up as if by magic. And that is very much not what we want here. And so there's this central corridor. The buildings have these knee walls to keep, separation between the different spaces, but you can see into them and all of the inner workings. Again, this is on the tour. And also we took advantage of space. What you'll notice is the composters, the dirtiest water is on the left and separated by that hallway and a couple of those knee walls from both the gray water and drinking water, which are on the right. And the gray water room, which is closest to us on the right, as well as the drinking water room, which is a bit to the left in this shot here, are separated physically by a wall. And there's also a sump in the floor there, so that if there's a spill, that captures the water at the place where it might cross into the room it's not supposed to be in. That doesn't have a drain in it because of the mechanics of the building, but it does have an alarm so that it starts yelling for help if we have any incident down in the basement. And so as I got a little bit too much storytelling on the rainwater, I'm now getting the curtain call to move along here. So what you see in the gray water room real quick is those filters, which are really just particle screens. The fresh gray water comes in here and just gets screened out for any debris that may clog up some of the other components. And then there's a pump in the bottom of each of these. So this box catches the raw gray water. You can see that pump right in the front. This gets pumped up to the planters in the lobby. And then after the planters, the water gets drained back down to the other box, which then has the exact same setup. And that other box discharges water out of the building toward that constructed wetland that we were just looking at. And you'll see this is identical, but notice the water is a heck of a lot cleaner in this box. This is receiving the discharge from those planters, which are incredibly efficient at removing some of the, all of the wastewater components with those microbes, just loving to eat those up. So let's move on from there, take a quick peek in the drinking water room, which is our treatment works. So what you see in the center of this shot is a couple of pumps which are pulling water out of those cisterns. There's a little equalizing tank at the bottom to keep those pumps happy. And then those pumps are going to pump the water through some of the components on the left. You see a couple of particle filters there. the two white sort of cylinders, and then those silver tubes are our UV disinfection device. As was mentioned earlier, Living Building Challenge requires us to attempt, when possible, when legal, treating water without the use of chlorine. We're going to talk a lot about that in the next section about lessons learned and challenges. But those are the UV filters. The water flows through there, and a high intensity of a very specific wavelength of light that deactivates a lot of the pathogens that can potentially cause disease. And then the water from there is pumped into the large pressure tank that's to the right, which then is our day tank for the building. So we fill that up periodically to keep the pumps running for short periods of time, and then that serves the building. And then importantly, we've got the, and Sarah, who is the next presenter, is saying, take my time, this is the best part. The other important component in this room is high on the right is a couple of plumbing pieces that bring in a connection. So you'll see there are two water meters there. And then if you follow that to the left, what you'll see is there are two pipes with valves. And notice that one set is connected and the other set is disconnected. So this is where a line from our fire protection system brings municipal water to the point of service for the building. And the other pipe connects our rainwater harvest system to the building. So this allows us to switch between the two systems, which has proven to be very important because there have been a ton of challenges with trying to deliver water that meets regulations and this is the critical piece, does so without the use of chlorine. We'll talk about the challenges about that in a minute when we get Sarah on the line here, because she's been very much involved with that. But currently the building, that connection is for the municipal water. The building is on town water right now, and we have a physical disconnection to the rainwater harvest system. This is important both for protection of public health, because we don't want untreated water being able to get into the system when we're, say, working on the rainwater. But it's also very important because when the town of Amherst is delivering water to this building, they are responsible for the health of the people in the building that are drinking the water, and they are not in control of our system. So it's very important that that spool piece that you see can connect one of these systems, but not both at the same time. Yeah, and as was pointed out, this isn't even in the drinking water guidelines, but everyone, the local Board of Health insisted that this was something that was going to be necessary. So if there's anything visual that we want to talk about that there are questions on in the drinking water room, definitely shout those out now, because we're about to leave and not come back. We'll certainly be talking more about what goes on in here, but in terms of the physical setup, definitely shout those out. But otherwise, let's turn to the composters and take a look at those.
Chris, it might be worth, well, sorry, while we're here, sorry, turn around. It might be worth just talking a little bit about, someone asked about what testing requirements are, and a lot of the beeping, booping things on the wall are
sure.
those testing requirements.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, so there's obviously, when we're talking about public water supply, the key thing to keep in mind is, even though this is a building that consumes about 100 gallons of water per day, it is under the same regulatory regime as the town of Amherst's water supply or the city of Boston's water supply. There are some caveats to that. There's a little bit of reduced testing because we're a smaller system, but in general, we're required to test for all of the same things. The most important of those is periodic bacterial testing, the presence or absence of fecal coliform bacteria in our finished water. If that is present, it means that we have a serious public health emergency and that things need to get shut down. That is basically telling us, is our treatment working on the basic fundamentals? But then there are another set of water quality indicators that we need to keep track of and have certain limits which we cannot exceed. What you see, the box with the green screen there is a turbidimeter. This is basically, this is to measure the cloudiness of the water to a level where it can't be seen by the naked eye, but where there are particles in the water that can refract light. Basically, it just shines a light through the water and figures out how much of it is coming through. And then on the right, you see a control panel that's attached to a pH probe. Interestingly, rainwater, which a lot of people don't realize is rainwater, even when it's not under the influence of some air pollution, is on the acidic side. And because the Massachusetts building code or the plumbing code requires all metal piping, in this case, copper piping throughout the building, there's the potential for then leaching copper into the water, which is something that our system is required to test for periodically. So keeping an eye on that pH, keeping an eye on whether we might need to control for pH is going to be important. It turns out that for whatever reason, there's a microclimate in Amherst where the water is actually fairly neutral to alkaline, and especially once it goes through the concrete cistern. So that hasn't been a problem for us, but it's certainly something that we needed to keep an eye on. And then you see that box with Rainbird on it. That's not a testing mechanism, but what that does is it actually has an irrigation timer on it to feed water through the turbidimeter. So this is just a little bit of innovation as we're trying to figure out how in the heck do we do this stuff? How do we keep it as automated as possible? Once a day in the early morning, that timer kicks on and we pump a trickle of water through the turbidimeter and then measure the turbidity of the water for a period of time. And then I guess the other piece of testing is on the opposite wall. There's a control panel on those UV. There are two control panels, one for each UV unit, that is constantly measuring the amount of UV light that's getting through the water. Actually, the black box is up higher. Those right there are measuring the transmittance of UV through the water. There's a certain minimum that we have to maintain at all times. And those are designed to shut the water off through a solenoid valve anytime we are not in compliance with the amount of UV that we're supposed to be delivering. So lots of checks and lots of fail safes, obviously, in a drinking water system. And, you know, as you can start to see, some of the controls that we have on these different systems are related to the level of water quality that we need to provide. If those rain gardens fail, what happens is the road gets wet. And it's not going to be good, you know, there's going to be big puddles and some potential flooding that's going to cause a headache for Hampshire College's maintenance staff, but nobody's going to get hurt. But if there's one error in this room, people get sick and that's a disaster. And so we, you know, these systems are designed with that in mind and taking those fail safes. And the regulations are designed to keep an eye on those standards also. And so there's a question about the alarms. So as I mentioned, the alarm on the UV shuts the water off. So there's an ability to monitor that alarm, but it actually turns the water off when there's a problem. Most of these are audible alarms that scream, and Sarah can hear them from her desk. And if there is a problem, she goes down and checks them. And because of the use of this building, there are also people looking in on things regularly. There's a building management system that also keeps an eye on things. Building management system, which I don't know if we'll have time to get into, but that has also been a major headache. The way I summarize it is that we've got a whole lot of smart devices, so then to try to take a brain to connect those smart devices has been a really big problem. Oddly, one of the biggest challenges was monitoring how much water we've been using. It turns out the ability to count ticks on a water meter is an incredibly difficult challenge that the industry has not addressed. The metering that we had on the water meters was set up to work the way an electric meter does, where it's looking for a peak use and a minimum use and an average over every 15 minutes. That means nothing in water. We want to know how many gallons went by, and the initial system that we had literally could not do it. We had to get the dean of the science college to program a custom computer interface to try to deliver that data in a way that our building management system could actually read. So one of the challenges of being on the leading edge.
Chris, we have a few questions about like the monitoring and management that I might as well just answer now.
Go for it.
So it's important to know, as Chris was mentioning, we are on municipal water right now. We are not using this system. When we are using this system, we do have a dedicated water operator, you know, someone that went and got a certification that says, I'm a water operator. I am responsible for the water quality in this building. So that's an outside contractor that we bring in. And right now, you know, we don't need that person. We're not using this water. And Jim says, do we get to talk about the role of chlorine or not chlorine? Yeah. So the reason that we're not currently using the water in this system, the shortest way I can describe it is one of the things Chris mentioned as our water quality requirements that we need to meet is a test for bacteria. That test is, Chris, what am I trying to say? What's the name of that test? Oh, HPC.
Yeah, and there's a very important distinction here that's critical to understanding this story. There is the testing for fecal coliform bacteria, which is an indicator that there's something in the water that could make people sick. Separately, there's the question of the chlorine and the testing that led to. So what this comes from is that the federal drinking water regulations require that surface water systems have disinfection. And one of the ways that we measure whether the water has been disinfected enough is to test the water at the tap to determine if there is a residual of chlorine still in the water. So the idea is, in a traditional plant, you chlorinate the water. There's a certain time and concentration factor that determines whether you've treated it enough, and then you release it into the system. And at the time that the water shows up at the most distant connection, there still needs to be chlorine in the water. The idea being that there could be a contamination somewhere in the system that needs to then be killed off when it gets to somebody's house. The quirk is that you can either prove that residual by measuring the chlorine in that downstream location, or you can measure for something else called heterotrophic bacteria through what's known as an HPC heterotrophic plate count test, which is essentially counting the bacterial colonies of anything in the water that will grow. This is not things that make you sick. There are literally millions of these bacteria on a piece of lettuce, but they're an indicator of overall water quality. And the idea is, if your water has been disinfected enough, that count will be low. In chlorinated, so the standard is 500 colonies per milliliter. Oddly enough, the town of Amherst water exceeds that requirement regularly, but because they have a chlorine residual, they don't have to test for it. Our system, because we're not adding chlorine, we can't test for a chlorine residual because there isn't one. So we were able, the state basically gave us permission to do this without chlorine if we could meet that HPC testing. Then we'll let Sarah pick up from there.
Yeah, so the shorter answer is we can't. Although, as Chris said, there's no indication that our water quality is low in any other respect. We just can't meet this particular indicator. And from what we've heard from other buildings that have systems like this, nobody else can either. I mean, basically the problem is, as Chris pointed out, chlorine is there to prevent bacterial regrowth. Our system does an awesome job of getting the water clean and treating it. When we test the water right after UV treatment, even our HPC counts are low, but we're then moving the water around the building through pipes, into that pressure tank that you can see, that big flow through pressure tank. So there is time that the water is hanging out in the building, and there's nothing to prevent bacterial regrowth at that point. So we do know that bacteria does grow in the building. We don't have any evidence that any of that bacteria is dangerous. And so, part of the question that is potentially going to be answered by us or other people is, are there different requirements that systems like this should be should be meeting to ensure water quality and water safety, but that weren't, requirements that weren't developed specifically for chlorinated systems. It's like a regulation versus safety issue. Non-compliant, but I don't think we're unsafe. But you have to be compliant to be legally allowed to serve water. So that's the kicker.
And we've got a good question here about, is this a flow issue? So I'll answer that first by saying, before we even got to flow, we scoured the system for potential areas of problem. The owl that we saw outside brings up one issue that we found. We had these baskets like you typically have on a roof drain that screened out debris that might be trying to get into the downspout. And what we discovered there after the first, growing season, or after the first fall, going up onto the roof, it was full of maple seeds and other debris and scum. And it turned out we had a stagnant pond up in those gutters. And I'm now struggling to come up with a couple of the other ideas that we had, but we sort of scoured the system for places where HPs, heterotrophic bacteria could be introduced, and to eliminate them. We certainly considered flow. One of the biggest regrets I think I have on this system was not building in recirculation right from the beginning, because one of the things is that because this building is so efficient with water, we're barely using any. And so the water flows very slowly through the building, and that gives the opportunity for those, infinitesimal amount of bacteria that's sneaking through our treatment system, not the kind that'll make you sick, not enough to cause a problem, but non-zero. It gives those a great place to set up shop and start growing. There is a design in the works to potentially add recirculation. My gut feeling is that's going to make it better, but it's not going to resolve this problem of the fact that essentially the standard we're being asked for is the elimination of all bacteria from the plumbing system of the building, which may be functionally impossible. But what does that mean? Well, that's the following question. We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth noting that systems like this are used on a residential scale, and those do not need to meet any of these requirements. Right. And when we've looked at those systems, we haven't seen any there have been no negative health outcomes associated with this kind of system. And we have to assume that they're facing the same kind of HPC issues as we are. So it's my gut feeling is it's more of a mismatch between the system being required to meet standards that aren't really applicable to this particular technology.
Well, and didn't we find that to be the case throughout the whole thing too, is like, we're sort of in the middle between very small systems on the one hand and like municipal systems on the other hand, and even the equipment, Chris, right? We talked about, finding a UV filter that was met the standard. By the time you get to one big enough that it has the standard, you're treating just so much more water than we would ever see in this building. So
yeah, I mean, just
the sort of a scale issue as well.
Yeah, the illustration of that is that we produce water at about 7 gallons per minute. The smallest UV filter we could find that met the state regulations was for 50 gallons per minute. So that gives you an idea of the scale that we're working with versus what's available. There's a question about retrofitting with chlorine. That is absolutely on the table as sort of the final result of this system. But given Hampshire's mission of trying to change the world, if at all possible, the goal is to prove that we can't do it any other possible way before we turn to that as a solution.
Well, and I will say also, given Hampshire's mission of not throwing money at problems that are already solved, if it turns out that chlorination is the only legal way to do this, we may decide to just use this water for a different purpose. There's plenty of uses on our campus that would be able to use the water quality that we'd get from untreated rainwater. I mean, just because we're not irrigating on the Kern Center site doesn't mean we're not irrigating literally the rest of campus. So for us, it's going to be, part of the benefit of this system is the learning opportunity and the opportunity to change regulation. If we get to a point where our only option is to chlorinate, we're not learning anything necessarily from a small scale chlorinated system. You know, we may decide, let's look at what this water of this quality could be used for elsewhere on campus. But that's just a personal Hampshire mission and finance question.
Yeah. And you can tell, obviously, we're still in the middle of this because we don't know. All right, obviously we're getting Q&A now, so that's great, and we'll continue with that. If there's anything else before we leave the water room that we want to address right this second, this is not going to be your last chance to ask questions, but as I mentioned, once we leave this room, we're not going to come back to it. And if we don't see anything pop up, then we'll look at the composters and then head upstairs to the last room on our tour. And so this is the Blackwater room, and these are the composter units. So there are six single stall restrooms in the building. Three toilets connected to each composter. And a lot of what happens here plumbing wise is at the top. You can see those green tubes are the 12-inch pipe that Christopher described. These toilets, to put it delicately, work on gravity. That's all there is to it. Waterless entirely, which is cool. As Christopher mentioned, that there are some practical considerations that one might want to consider there. So the waste contributions come through those pipes and drop into the top of the composter. Periodically, I don't know if it's once a week or every 2 weeks.
Once a week.
Once a week, wood shavings get dropped into that door at the top. And then raked in to mix the waste with that carbon source. And then things sit there and nature takes its course. An important feature that you'll notice at the top is the fan. Oh, we can look at either one. There's a fan at the top. That white component there is basically constantly running. So that is creating negative pressure in the restrooms, which actually sucks the air down through the green tube into the composter and then exhausts it from the building. So we're constantly, that A brings all of the odors that may be created in the restroom and pulls them down into the composter and then out of the building, which is an important for indoor air quality and that sort of thing. It also means that we're constantly bringing fresh air into the composters because the composters are meant to be an aerobic, oxygen-loving process. They're really, really efficient at breaking this down. So, you know, as we said, Sarah, when things are normally running, do you have a count on how many people are going through this building on a typical day when school's in session?
About 1,000 a day.
And so they're not all using
a lot of butts
necessarily, but there's a lot of people in this building. And these are the 2 composter units that have not been emptied since the building opened in 2016. So that gives you some idea about how efficient these can be at breaking down the solid waste. And so Claire, yeah, let's pull the hatch and let everybody see what we're all waiting for. And this is what's left. It's dirt. It's plant food at this point, basically. It is what it is. It's not waste anymore. It is compost. What you will notice, an important feature here is over to the right a little bit is there's a pump. So the liquid that comes through, which is primarily urine, there is a small misting device on here that adds just a tiny dose of water. So they're not 100% waterless, but virtually to keep that compost mass moist. But the water that trickles down to the bottom is periodically pumped out to a holding tank that you'll see on the back side. Over here. And you can see, we're almost ready to empty those. So this is the liquid component. And so just to back up here for a second, in Massachusetts, the composting toilets are an approved device on the accepted plumbing list. You do have to get Board of Health local approval to install them. That was something that, you know, with a few conditions and caveats, we got granted by the local folks. And part of those regulations say that the solid material can be removed from the composters and buried on site under 6 inches of clean soil. So the intention is to use those, to use that solid material, which will need to be removed in the near future under a planting bed. Ornamental plants only, we're not allowed to grow food on it, but we are gonna put that to beneficial use. And you know, during the design process, there were questions about, well, how are we going to unload these? Do we need a ramp so that we can get wheelbarrows down here or to fit them into the elevator or whatever? That was all turned out to be silly questions. The answer is a couple of 5-gallon buckets is what you need to remove all of the compost to give us another couple of years of use of the toilets. The liquid is a little bit of a different story. Currently, the regulations allow the liquid to be discharged to a septic system that has a septic tank, which we don't have. And even if we did, that could be problematic for our pilot program because there are certain water quality targets that we have to hit. And so without that opportunity, legally, the only thing that we can do with this water right now, unfortunately, is have it pumped out and brought to the wastewater treatment plant. So this is one spot where we have not truly met net zero water at this point, but we can say a couple of things on the positive side there. Certainly the volume of water is probably 1% of what we would normally be sending to the wastewater treatment plant. And there's also been some regulatory movement on this. The Mass DEP has sort of given the green light to the opportunity for doing a pilot program to reuse this water as liquid fertilizer, which is potentially something we are looking at doing on the Hampshire College farm in a controlled sort of way where we can study, you know, both the practical and the environmental and health aspects of being able to reuse this. But the, you know, the long-term goal is that there be a regulatory change that says the liquid leachate from these composters under certain conditions and criteria be allowed for beneficial reuse and recapture of those nutrients. The nitrogen available in that water is amazing. And I'm sure there's some people on this call that are aware of that. So that's something that we're very hopeful for in the future. I think I answered that one question that popped up about the compost. We're not allowed to spread it. It does have to be buried. But that is, you know, straight out of the regulations, we're allowed to bury it. We're working with the Board of Health just to make sure that that goes to an appropriate spot where it's not going to be accessed. Our hope is definitely to put in an ornamental planting bed right near the building so that we can say to everybody, here is the end result of all of the waste that the building's generated over the last several years. And so if there are any other compost questions, happy to address those here. Otherwise, we'll go up to the lobby and take a look at things there. So the liquid waste, I glossed over that a little bit. We are not tied into the municipal system. We do not have a sewer connection. What happens is a septage hauler, which is the kind of company that would pump out a septic tank, comes. What you can see is the larger pipe you're looking at. I think it's the larger pipe. But one of the pipes coming out of this box is tied to a hookup on the side of the building, so that that pump truck can just pull up to the building, drag a hose over to the side of the building, connect, and then pump the liquid out and carry it away. Which is also, if we do get permission to do that farm project, or in the long term to be able to use it regularly as fertilizer, one of the practical challenges is how easy is it going to be for the farmer to come over with their own pump truck and suck the water out, but we are set up to be able to do that pretty readily. All right, and so then you can head upstairs, I guess. And so as Claire's going upstairs, you know, the permitting story on the gray water was not quite as challenging as it was with the drinking water, but it was somewhat interesting. So what we're operating under in Massachusetts is known as Title V, which is the septic system regulations. And basically the first line in Title V is that it says that when it is, and the word is feasible to connect a building to a municipal sewer, thou shalt do it, period. And I mean, it's pretty clear that the point of septic systems is where a sewer system is not available. But the very next line says that if you've got an idea for a system that could treat the water just as well as a municipal wastewater treatment plant, you can apply to do a pilot program. And if you convince the state that it's likely to work, they will let you install it. And then you do not need to connect to a sewer. And then you have to monitor that system for 18 months and submit another report saying whether it did in fact work or not. And if it did, you have the potential to use that system permanently. So this is really interesting. It wasn't written for this sort of situation. It was written for manufacturers who had, you know, advanced treatment systems or just alternative ways of disposing of septic waste, giving them an opportunity to create new products and having a structure to evaluate them and then potentially put them into general use. But there was absolutely nothing to stop us from taking advantage of this provision on a particular system on a particular site. And so we did so. And again, we were very fortunate to have a group of people at DEP, and particularly in the Western Mass office of DEP, who were totally on board with, as long as we were complying with the letter of the law, going and doing our thing to try to find a sort of better way to deal with this stuff. And so that's what we've done. What you're looking at here is the gray water planters. As you can see, there is some very robust plant growth here. These plants love the water input. They love the nutrient input. And one of Sarah's jobs is to keep them tamed and keep cutting away the biomass that we get growing out of these things, because they really thrive here. And you can see this is on the southern side of the building next to that curtain wall. So these get a ton of sunlight. So we've got light-loving plants that have a lot of water uptake. We certainly get a lot of evapotranspiration in this area. One of the design features is on the other side of the building. We've got some peace lilies, low light on the north side of the building that like the shade, but are still able to take up the water. And if you'll think back to that detail, you know, the way these work is there's a drip irrigation pipe just under the surface that doses water near the top. And then it's just 2 feet of sand is what we put in there. The water trickles down through that sand. Over time, we've built up some biofilm that chews up the pollutants as they're going by. And then, the proof was in the pudding downstairs as we looked at the two different waters and the two different filters, is it really takes a ton of contaminants out of that water. It's really highly efficient. And that's in no small part to this being that aerobic process with a lot of oxygen in there. This is also a place where we've had a ton of challenge from the beginning of the project. And a ton of that challenge comes from the other major feature of this lobby, which is just to Claire's right, which is the Kern Cafe, which is a commercial coffee bar. It's not as busy as Starbucks, but it basically is one in terms of what they're putting out. And as you might imagine, college kids and college administrators love their coffee. So there's a lot of coffee going through here. You know, most of it is leaving in bodies. It may be leaving through the composters, I guess, but there certainly is some coffee waste. Obviously espresso is very popular, and that is a super fine coffee. And what people don't realize about coffee is it's got a ton of oil in it. So that's a challenge. And the other thing is, in some ways, it's a dairy delivery device. If you think about a latte is actually more milk than it is coffee. And so, you know,
I guess we lost Chris for a second. Well, in any case, so part of the issue that we faced with this, with these planters is the amount of dairy that they put into the system. So, you know, Chris was talking about that dairy, he was talking about the oil. When the building first opened, we were encountering a pretty hefty odor that happened in the building. And people, of course, were starting to blame the composters, but it was not, in fact, the composters. The issue was that those fine espresso grounds and the dairy fats and the coffee oils were creating kind of a sludge that started to clog up the irrigation pipes in each of these planters. So we were getting lots of water in some places, not enough water in other places, ponding on the surface of the planters. And, you know, after some investigating, we realized that one of the major issues was the dairy. So we were able to change the way that we use the system to divert dairy from that process. So now in the cafe, if there's leftover milk or, you know, part of steaming that needed to chuck out, it doesn't go down the sink. It goes into a special dairy compost bucket. And we're fortunate enough that we have an end use for that. It gets taken by our campus farm and gets fed to the pigs. So instead of creating clogging issues, we get to make bacon out of it, or just cute animals, depending on your persuasion.
All right,
so that was really an operational.
I'm back now.
Hey, I'm telling our dairy story.
That's great. That's where you knew what story I was telling.
I got you.
So I think that this would be a good time to pause and just check for questions, because we are starting to creep toward 10 o'clock, and Sarah and I will keep telling stories about milk sludge all day if you let us.
Great. So you're transitioning to questions. Bruce, did you want to, I think we have about 8 minutes left. I know that you had some questions that you wanted to ask. I'm wondering if we want to do those or if we want to open it up to the floor.
Sorry, let's open it up to the floor first. I want the participants to have a chance, and then I could fill in if we need to.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask right now is if anyone has a question, can you put it in the chat, and then we're going to ask you to, if we have time, to say it out loud. So Jim, why don't you come on and ask your question to everyone.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. I got to say, just love this. This is fantastic. We need to do way more of this. My question was, do you see other things like the dairy sludge? I remember that story from early on.
Yeah.
But do you see other things either coming up or like that are like, whoa, this is something that really messes with those systems?
Yes. So yeah, I mentioned the espresso grounds. That's been a huge piece. Actually, the best solution to keeping coffee grounds out was nylon pantyhose. We didn't see in those gray water filters is actually on the outlet pipe. We stuck a legging on the end of it, and that is just this amazing, flexible, fine particle screen that catches a lot of that stuff and keeps it out of the system, which then keeps some of the oil with it as well. But by when we solved the dairy issue directly, made a huge difference in the system, but it didn't solve the problem. We still had a lot of clogging issues. What turned out to be what we think might have been the silver bullet is the original drip irrigation that we put in had those pressure compensating drippers on it so that you can have a real slow, constant drip of water. Because they were so small and fine and slow, it caused those to get clogged, which then meant the water stagnated with a pump running and creating heat in those boxes in the basement, which grew more biomass, which created more clogging, which was sort of a vicious cycle. And one day we just decided, you know what, let's take one planter, rip those pipes out, and put in a piece of HDPE pipe with holes drilled in it. And that was like a different world, where we started to get a dose rest cycle where we'd sort of flood the top of those planters within a few minutes and then turn the water off. And so far, that has been much, much better. There's been very little clogging since then, and everything seems to be working a lot more efficiently. So yeah, I mean, it was the fine particles and some of the fat oil and grease that was getting into the system that's been the challenge from the beginning.
Fantastic, thanks.
Great, and I see another question from Neil Angus. Neil, can you come on and ask your question?
Sure, thanks, Meredith. Just curious, I know there's a ton of co-benefits, in these systems that, are hard to quantify, but just wondering if you did any kind of first cost analysis or comparison versus a traditional system. and estimated any kind of, payback if there was any extra cost associated?
Chris, I think I can kind of take this because I think
Yeah.
we didn't do a lot of analysis to compare against the typical system because we knew we weren't going to do that at the offset. So we actually don't have hard numbers to do that comparison. But having been the architect of the whole project, when we're asked this question about first costs for just living building or net zero energy or all those things, most of the categories that the living building challenge covers, we can say with a lot of confidence that the worst case scenario is a 5% increase. For example, if we think about the red list or things like that, the materials that we're using don't carry an enormous cost to them. The one caveat is our entire water system. So I would say that when you're comparing a system like the one that you just were presented to traditional, connect to a municipal system and you're paying for water and sewer, there's no way you're going to be able to get a reasonable payback on a scale of a building of this size. And that is something that I think, again, just sort of reiterates the scale issue that we have. Again, just because there aren't standards in place that really apply for a building of this scale, there aren't products that are readily available that are approved and things like that. In this case, this I think really was one that we all, or at least the client, was really adamant about trying to tackle, and not necessarily on a cost benefit analysis from the beginning. And so I think that's where this topic, this net zero water one, is always the one that's contentious, especially in our New England region. I still feel really strongly that this was an important one for us to tackle. I'm really proud of the fact that we did, but it's extremely challenging, I would say, to make a financial case for it on a building of this scale. So that's the one caveat. And I know, Sarah, you have something you want to add to that.
Yeah, no, I will. So I question all the time. And so I've run rough numbers. Like, how do you compare this to a normal building? Because would we have put flush toilets in a normal building? Probably. So then that argument gets different. I will say that from a cost perspective, the composting toilets are very cost effective.
Yes.
Operating cost for those is we have a maintenance contract with Clivis, who comes out and does quarterly maintenance just to keep everything like we get to. So I think of that similar to a maintenance any have in a building. Ours happens to be the toilets. And even from a perspective there, the cost of that maintenance about breaks even to what we would spend if we had to pay for the sewer effluent in this area. So composting toilets, totally cost effective, very pro composting toilets. Our gray water system is a little bit more in the middle. It's still more, I think at this point, though, because we're still working out kinks, it's still more expensive than it would be if we were just connected to the municipal sewer. If we were able to just use a septic tank, that might be really cheap, but I would say that the gray water generally is still fairly cost effective, once it's completely figured it out. If you're not trying to operate a coffee bar, it would probably be cost effective within the first few years. As Christopher said, the one that still probably isn't cost effective, at least a building scale, is this water harvest and treatment for potable use. I think if you're doing a larger development and you want to create a water system that's for a whole campus or a neighborhood, that is where that scale will probably start cost reasonable. But on a building scale, it's just not there yet.
And
guys, I am noticing. Sorry, I just want to say that I'm noticing the time. We have about 1 minute left. I'm happy to keep this open and go over if people want to hang out for a little bit. I think one of the main differences between public and private or in person and these events are these events just go boom and you're done, where you often have time to kind of chat and all. And so I think we can leave the room open for a little bit. I just wanted to know that a lot of people also just have another meeting coming up right after this. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And so I want to give a thank you to Christopher, to Sarah, to Chris, to Bruce, and to Claire, who's at the building, really for organizing this. This has been amazing. And please come back in December where we're going to be doing more of this. I also wanted to let you know that we have a event on embodied carbon coming up on the 28th. So please join us for that one. We're going to be having 5-minute lightning presentations from people all around the world talking about, all around the country talking about embodied carbon. And there will also be, like this event, time to connect with people. We were supposed to have a second breakout room and we went right over it, so that's okay. But maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion now. So that's it for me. If you need to drop off, you need to drop off, but we'll keep it open if you guys want to continue the conversation.
Super. Thanks, Meredith, and thanks to all the presenters. I really appreciate it. But yes, I'll be able to hang on for a few minutes more.
So what I was jumping in there on was on the gray water question. And I think that to me, what's important with the gray water is that what we've done for gray water treatment in a lot of ways doesn't make sense, but it's what we're required to do to avoid a connection. The coffee is a special case, but even that other project, the Hitchcock Center, which just has sink water essentially going to the gray water system, still had to do a big septic tank and constructed wetland in order to avoid that connection. What we're talking about is water that's basically clean to begin with. So if there were a way that we could more routinely deal with that on site without what's probably unnecessary levels of treatment, that could be both cost effective and start to relieve the load on some of our wastewater treatment plants. I mean, the idea that we take gray water right now that's basically clean to start with from commercial buildings certainly, and then mix it with water that's truly dirty and then bring it down to a wastewater treatment plant where we then try to extract those two apart is certainly fertile grounds for finding a better way. So while this gray water system may not be cost effective, the hope is that through projects like these, we can get to a future where they are.
Hey, Bruce, why don't you give a plug for the next session?
Yeah, thank you. Am I unmuted? Yeah. So yeah, the next session, and one of the, I think the comment that came up, and Jim, you pointed it out, was the concept of return on investment. That in urban areas is much more clearer, and Sarah alluded to it, what's the cost of the alternative, the cost of municipal sewer and water. And we'll be diving into that in urban projects where the buildings are a larger scale, where there's more water to collect from. But the focus will be non-potable reuse rather than potable reuse in our New York City projects, and the approval we have to go forward in the MWRA is based on reclaiming black water and making it into a clean, clear, and safe non-potable water for toilet flushing, cooling water, commercial laundries, what have you. Irrigation. So look forward to that one. And the third one is also going to be super when we bring the energy piece into all this, because that's critical with the